Are you ready to manage your work and personal world better to live a fulfilling, productive life? Then you've come to the right place. Productivity Cast, the weekly show about all things productivity. Here are your hosts, Ray Sidney Smith and Augusto Pinaud, with Francis Wade and Art Gelwicks.
Welcome back, everybody, to this episode of Productivity Cast. This is episode 028, which is episode 28. How many email accounts do you have and why? So email is possibly one of the most powerful communications technologies developed to date. Harnessed properly, you can reach almost anyone in the working world easily and quickly. And as email has grown in its uses, so too has the number of email accounts each of us sort of has around us. How many email accounts do you have? Why do you have them? And are multiple email accounts making you more productive? That is the topic of discussion today here on Productivity Cast.
Your question is how many emails I have or how many emails I want?
I think it's going to be a little bit of both today. Let's start it off with the discussion on how many email accounts each of us does have. And then we'll get into the whys of those things. I think it's just important for us to sort of square up and see what the group here today is kind of dealing with. So I'll start off and I'll say that I have 4 email accounts, and the rest I have several other email addresses, but in terms of email accounts, I have 4, and the aliases, the email addresses that forward to my primary 4 accounts are many, but only 4 accounts. How about you, Augusto?
Oh, I have a little bit more than that. I actually don't even know the number. I was opening my iPad to see how many actually there are so I can count. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 email accounts, plus I manage my 2 kids, so that will be 10. I have my kids have email addresses, and I have them in there so I can manage what is coming in, what is coming out, and all that, because, well, I think that's important. It's important to set that I have, so out of those 10 accounts, 2 are my kids. 1 is our family account. 1 is my personal account. I also have an email address that every time they say, "Oh, can you subscribe to this?" That's the email I use. So that's a junk email. And then the rest of them are work. I have a job. I also am a writer, a public speaker that have their own email address, and I have a couple of businesses on the side that have their own email addresses. And so it's challenging to manage 10 emails accounts. Yes, it is. Will I do it in a different way? No, I will not. And I will love to get into more of that as the show progresses.
I have like about 15 maybe. Only 3 of them are what I would call public facing. So when I set up an email account that the public can see, it has a very different purpose than one which is hidden. So only 3 of the 15 are for the general public to communicate with me. The others serve different purposes.
Last count I had 6. I have 3 personal and 3 various business ones. One that's actually business address, one that's company address for another company, and one that's a client email address. And that's where things start to get a little goofy, where you get these selective email addresses that are targeted at a specific audience, or that you get because you need access to something. So ipso facto, you wind up with another email address just to be able to get into something. So right now I've got 6 active. The ones that I really use, I'd say there's probably 2.
And I didn't include some of the application specific email addresses just for audiences edification. Like Evernote, provides you with an email address that emails items as a note into your system, or Remember the Milk or Todoist, where they generate an email address that would function to send you things, but they send you to your task inbox as opposed to your email inbox. So I'm kind of separating those.
Maybe that's what we need to think about with this, is that rather than thinking about email addresses, think about email inboxes, places where we're actually sending and receiving email. Because you're right. If I think about dedicated email addresses tied to a specific application, I'm easily in double digits without batting an eye. So.
Right, and that's why I was very clear to say email accounts and not email addresses, because you could easily start to mount the number of email addresses in the dozens once you realize how many things are actually tied to email. For example, every cell phone, at least in the United States, has an email address associated with it. So if you have a cell phone number, your carrier has an email address associated with it. You may not know it and you may not be using it, but there's an email address there. So not to confuse people too much, but I do like the fact that we have a lot of options and ways to get in touch with each other. So now I want to talk as we make our way forward about why we have these email addresses, and more importantly, what was the reason, what was the impetus for these email accounts coming into being? Like, why do you have all of these email addresses? And then whether or not they actually benefit or challenge your productivity. I will say that I've had many, many more email addresses in the past, and I have worked very, very hard to reduce the number of email addresses so that I didn't have as many places to process and clarify. And so I'm curious, Augusto, you started off the conversation with a little bit of the background in terms of your email addresses. Can you tell us a little bit about what started this having 10 email addresses? You said to us that you were not interested in changing. So that means it's serving you well. And I'm curious about how it does that.
When I got my first email I think was pretty early, around 1993 or 94, when I got my first Hotmail account. That it was really funny, because when you said, "Oh, my email is Hotmail," people look at you like, "Ah," and it was like, "No, it's Microsoft." Okay, I thought, sorry, it has nothing to do with hot per se, but it was a joke at the time. And soon after that, I got my work email, my first work email. So I start from the beginning managing two accounts, in the same way that some books talk about how people has never seen inbox zero, because when you open a new account, you already start with 3 emails in the inbox. In the same way, my first experience with email was already with 2 accounts. But for me, allows me to really get into the right frame of mind. I have worked as a road warrior for a really, really long time. And when you are a road warrior, you have only micro windows of time to look things. And you need to be really conscious on what you open and what you are going to see. Otherwise, what happens is you can't be effective. When you are traveling and you are sitting in the lobby to visit a customer and you have maybe 4 minutes, okay, you cannot open 10 inbox and see what emails came in there. You need to be really conscious on what you open and what. In the same way, as I've been saying for years, I don't check email on my iPhone. There is only one email address I check on my iPhone, and it's my kid's address. Okay, and the reason is simple: the volume of emails there is really low, and it happened to work fine. Other than that, emails get checked where I process them, that is on my iPad. But having those 10 inboxes allows me to really look at the material or the input in the frame of mind that I need based on what these emails accounts are. Sometimes I get the same email 3 times because it comes to the 3 work emails, and it's part of the deal. But if I will see that email in a general inbox the 3 times together, it will be harder for me to figure it out what is the kind of response or the appropriate response I need to give to that input. So that's the reason keeping that high number of addresses allow me to really be able to respond and track things a lot more effectively for me.
So it sounds to me like email accounts equate to context or categorization of the email messages so that you're able to give the appropriate response in as expedient a fashion as you can.
It is the same thing for the paper inbox. There is no difference. If you work on an office where you get input for multiple businesses, you should have multiple inboxes of paper. Why? Well, because I'm sorry, the bill that comes from business A may not have the same priority of the paper who came from business B. And when you mix them all, you are expecting that your brain is going to be able to refocus quickly between business A needs, business B needs, and the rest of the junk you get. The reality is there is no difference between that and multitasking. And we can argue about how effective some people think multitasking is, but the reality is, I've been proved over and over how ineffective it is. When I receive email that way on a massive inbox, all the emails together, what happened is my brain got into multitasking mode, and I tend to take or to make worse decisions and to look at the input in a completely different way.
Francis, do you want to tackle why you have those email inboxes and a little bit about this idea of public-facing versus private-facing email addresses or private email addresses versus public email addresses?
Yeah, so I have a few that are just for sort of, I would say, subscription purposes or testing purposes, or I give them to only one or two or three companies to send me subscriptions. I have one that actually is located only on my mobile phone and my tablet. So I only use it to forward stuff to myself that I want to read later at my leisure. Because as I think I described in a prior episode, I use my tablet as a consumption device. So if there's something I want to consume and it's too long to dispense with immediately, I take it out of my main inbox and forward it to this email address that's only on my remote devices. So then I can consume it at my leisure. So I'm using them to coordinate different kinds of messages from different kinds of inputs. As I said before, I only use 3 of them to interface with the public. So those are the 3 that I check, because as far as I'm concerned, when I set up an email address and I publicize it in any way, I'm making a promise to whoever the people are who are aware of it that I'm going to check that email address. So it's a little bit like setting up a mailing address or a PO box. You sort of implicitly make a promise or an agreement with the public that you're going to be going through it and processing the items that it receives on a regular basis. And I think, it's a mistake for people to open an email inbox or open an email address and then publicize it and then decide to use a different platform, but never close down the prior email address. So then the public is left thinking that they can use that email address. And sure enough, there'll come a time where you'll get some important email to an address that you no longer check, which is just a pain in the neck. But you're the one who set the email address up. You're the one who publicized it. And it's your responsibility to either close it down or put in a reply email that says, I'm no longer using this address. Here's my new one. But an email address is a sort of an implicit handshake with the public, if it's public facing, that I will use it and I will accept it, which is why I really hate being forced to accept an email address or an inbox. So the conversation we had before about all these different apps providing you with all these wonderful inboxes are awful. I hate them. And I don't want to have to go and check an inbox when I've been forced to use it, when I haven't elected to use it. I should be given the option in every case of forwarding to a current email inbox or not using it at all. But to be given it and then expect that if they send you an email and say, oh, by the way, your account is in arrears and it's about to be canceled, and the only place they send it to is that inbox, all of a sudden they've created a new demand on my time. I hate those. I hate extra inboxes. and I would love to consolidate all of them into one if I could, but I can't. So I just complain.
Understandable. I mean, we all have to get out our frustrations somehow.
On the podcast.
Right. Just sharing the love. How about you, Art? What has brought the number of email addresses you have to bear?
Well, I've got thinking about it and listening to everybody else on the podcast here. I'm trying to categorize them because the more I think about it, the more I realize I have. There's 3 main addresses that I really work with. One is my Gmail address, which has wound up being basically a migration address from old systems. So, for example, when I had a Yahoo account, that since everybody's on Yahoo got compromised many years ago, and they're just now taking blame for it. That traffic, when I stopped using that Yahoo email account, was forwarded to my Gmail account. But also other ones like the AOL account, that got forwarded. Actually, that got forwarded to Yahoo, which then came to Gmail. So it's been a progressive move through the old systems to Gmail, which I've had for forever. But that's my primary box for a couple reasons. One, because it just happens to be the one that's tied to my Google account. So whenever you sign into anything, that's the one that you're using. Secondarily, though, it's the one that everybody kind of understands the domain name. If you say whatever your email address is at gmail.com, they get it. They don't have to ask how you spell that. It's become fairly ubiquitous. The second one I have is tied to my name in owning a domain. So one of the things I did, and I actually recommend everybody does this if they have the opportunity, go out and see if the domain name for your last name is available, and if so, get it. Because that becomes very handy. The one thing we haven't really talked about with domain name or with emails, and this ties into the third address I have, is emails can become almost a branding item. So, for example, if you're running a small business or you're an entrepreneur and you're trying to get some credibility in the industry, sending out your emails under a Gmail domain versus sending them out under your own domain name creates a totally different image. And that's where you wind up starting to accumulate some of these. You wind up with redirects of variants of your email domains. So I have those 3. I have my personal domain name that I use for personal stuff. I have my Gmail account, which is kind of the catch-all big bucket. And then I have my company email name, which is tied to my company's domain name. But I think that's one of the things that we don't take into consideration is that domain name tied to an email address can actually be part of our branding. Now, to echo Francis's comment, sticking me with inboxes that I don't need and don't want drives me bonkers. Comcast, I'm talking to you, because when they create your user account, you get a Comcast email box. I didn't want it. Don't give it to me, but I'm still stuck with it. And where does all the correspondence go? In there. So it may be convenient for them, but it's sure not convenient for the end user. Is this problem going to go away? Where I don't have multiple inboxes like this? I don't see any way it can. It comes down to the tool you interact with it. And I don't want to get ahead of myself here and ahead of us in this conversation, but the email addresses become less of the issue the more you think about how you're going to manage what they're generating. So that's me in a nutshell.
Yeah, I would agree. In my case, I have the 4 email accounts, as I said, and I have prior email accounts that I have just basically forwarded to the ones that currently exist, right? So I consider those in a state of inactivity, and I only keep them forwarding to me for purposes of if someone in the past needs to still get in touch with me and has an old email address for that purpose. And once the email has the forwarding of the amount of email has reached a certain threshold, that is bottom level threshold, then I cease the account. So, for example, my Yahoo account for many years, as well as Hotmail, right, which then converted to live.com, those email accounts received some level of traffic for some number of years. And once I had updated everyone in my personal life that I had moved to a Gmail account, then I killed the accounts, right? So, and I have only kept my Yahoo account, which thankfully, I had two-factor authentication on for all this time. So, as many years as they've had it, that is. So even with the compromise, it was like, it's not that big of a deal. I don't have any personal data in there, and I only use it to log into things that are Yahoo related. So that email account no longer exists for me. And the four, though, now are my personal Gmail, a professional personal email, that is my website domain for all of my productivity stuff, and then the two business ones. And that's it. I really try to keep it very simple. And this brings me to my sort of next concept or next question for you all, which is, do you feel like the number of email accounts today benefit us or hurt us in the long run? Do you, or is there an optimal number of email accounts that everybody should have? What are your general guidelines for the number of email accounts that people should have, and should they attempt to limit them purposefully, or should they have a lot of email addresses for many things? For example, there was once upon a time when there was a lot of productivity articles out there that were talking about you should have a separate email address for all of your newsletters, and you should have a separate email address for this and that. And is that still practical today? And I want to talk a little bit about that, and then we'll get to talking about email applications that can really help us manage these multiple accounts better. But I'm curious here on a more not theoretical but strategic level. What can we do here to create email accounts
I'll jump
and
in on
email
that
addresses that is as well
one.
effectively?
I used to, or still do. I still teach in my classes that the idea is to have a single, somewhat physical location to process all emails. So when it comes to processing, you don't want the problem that I mentioned before, which is that you have inboxes in different websites, God forbid, different devices, different apps. The ideal solution is to have ubiquitous access from one easy to use interface, so that you can process all of the items in one place. It's just a matter of flipping between accounts or flipping between selections, let's call it, or options. But you're able to look at every single piece of email that's coming in one single application or screen. Now, the reason I argue that is that you don't want hidden inboxes anywhere in your life. You don't want to have to go search. You want to reduce the friction that it takes to jump from one email inbox to another, so that you can get in and out as quickly as possible. Basically, dispense them as fast as possible. Get to zero as quickly as possible without having to jump or guess. So all inboxes should come to one place. Now, I don't know of an app or device that allows for that. The closest is perhaps my smartphone, where I can direct all of my email to a single device. So at least it's to one small screen. It's not optimal, so there's still room for someone to come up with an app that brings together every single inbox, every single email address, IMAP, POP, everything into one, so it works seamlessly. I haven't discovered that yet, but that's what I would love to see in the future. One physical location to process everything.
I believe that you should have as many as you need and as few as you can get by. That I understand doesn't answer the question, and sometimes it's frustrating when you answer that. But the point that I'm trying to make is it's good. It's good to split. It's good to divide and conquer as far as your division and granularity don't start playing against productivity. So, for example, if I look at my work email, okay, technically I should have, instead of one inbox, 4 email inbox. I could. Why? Well, because I take part of some of the efforts in marketing, I take some of the efforts in sales, some of the efforts in the software development. Okay, and that's technically 3 roles in the organization. So can I go and instead of have one email address, have 3 for them? Yes. Will that be effective? No. That's the reason I have one. Okay, but I don't want to mix now those with my writing emails, public speaking emails. So that is important now to make that distinction. And that is what I think people need to stop for a moment and think. There is people who really have no ability to manage more than one inbox. And that is fine too. Then forward everything to that inbox and you will be okay. But if you have the ability to do that, what is going to help you do is to stay a lot more focused on the email on hand, because the emails you're going to receive are going to be related at least to something. One of the problems with the general email accounts is you receive about everything. Okay. And that, again, for me, because I'm an awful multitasker, okay, it's not convenient because I cannot I am unable to focus to the point that I can produce things that are useful.
There was a way in Gmail for a while, and I think it still exists, where you can actually create basically subversions of an email address. So you could have like art.
It still exists.
Okay. So you could have like art plus junk mail and use that. The challenge that I'm facing is actually 2 questions that I'm going to throw back at you guys to understand this a little better. One, when you're shutting down these email addresses, finally getting them put to bed, are you worried you're going to miss anything? And 2, if you have content that's archived in those old email systems, which I think we all do, what do you do with it?
So this is an easy one for me. One, at some point, the threshold gets so low that it's kind of FOMO, right? It's fear of missing out almost more than it's actual real communication being missed. This is just me personally, but for most of us today, I can find you by Google. You know, like if I really lose your email address, I can still find you in some way, shape, or form. That it's not really a big deal. As it relates to anything that's important to me that I signed up for, like an account or something like that, I am particular enough. I'm let's say detail oriented enough, or maybe just anxious, type A, whatever. And I have made a list of all of those things that are assigned to every email account. So I know to go in and update my email address for those things. And if I don't, if I miss something, then the forwarding of that email over time gets picked up because it's forwarding to me. Once I've changed all the things that are important, then the email address is no longer really useful. And if I am just waiting for that one person 6 years from now who might email me, then I'll just leave the forwarding on, right? But there's some point in which I decide, okay, I haven't received a forward from that email address in 5 years. It's time for it to go. There's just no reason for me to keep that open loop out there. As far as the data is concerned, most email applications, localized desktop email applications, allow you to be able to move email from one account to another. Thunderbird, Opera, I believe even Outlook allows you to do this. And I just move that email to an archive in the new email account. So, when I transitioned from Yahoo and Hotmail to Gmail, I just move that email from there to an archived folder within the new Gmail system.
Yeah, I wonder about the archives, because I have maybe about 10 gig of archived, none of which I actually looked at in years. so I wonder if I really need it. Need anything other than maybe 12 months in the past. I know I've retrieved the odd email and it's been good to retrieve it when I needed it, but if I look at my own practice, I think that anything more than 12 months out isn't really needed. So I'm not as worried as I was. And I echo Ray's sort of view that things have changed, and a single email address is no longer the easiest way to get someone or find someone or reach them. There's a million other methods that are currently available. And if someone is even somewhat internet savvy, they'll use all of them. This actually happened to me the other day, to track someone down, to try WhatsApp, Facebook, old email address, his website, which had a new email address. I left a message on his phone. I had to try a whole bunch of them. Turns out he was down because he had the flu. So it had nothing to do with the methods I was using. It's just that he couldn't respond because he was sick for about a week. But there's so many different ways. One email address unreplied is as much of a burden as it used to be.
I wanted to also place a difference here in two ways. One is that I actually like the separation of my email by context for when and where I'm going to need them and the best place for me to be able to process them. So in my world, I get hundreds of emails a day, and I cannot process them all in the same context. So I just don't have them all on my phone, and I actually keep different ones separated. So for example, I don't count this as my email address, but I manage an email address for my mom, and we use it for being able to log into her Kindle and send her books digitally and otherwise, right? And hi, mom out there, but she's not very technologically savvy, so she'll never hear this podcast episode anyway. But the point is that,
and that will be the next comment we will get from a listener. Will be your mother telling you, "I was paying attention."
Very, very unlikely, but
moms have networks and communications channels that we are not aware of. Four dudes on a podcast. Trust me, we have no idea what they're able to do to us.
Yes. So we, that's an email account that I have no desire to have on any system of mine. So I only log into it through the, web interface in order to be able to access at times. So I think be wary of the idea of having multiple accounts, and even those that may not be managed. You may be managing but are not yours. So take ownership and commitment only to the email accounts that you need to. I think that's important to sort of keep in mind. And as in my case, if you are very, very email heavy, I have all but turned off all notifications on my phone for the influx of email coming in for work. And I only process that at specific times of day on the desktop. And we're going to have a whole episode on email processing inbox zero. So I'm not getting too much into that, but I just want to say that having email accounts in different places is not always the wrong thing. It just really depends upon your work style and also your personal lifestyle, right? So for me, I don't check my personal email every day. I check it actually very infrequently, usually once a week. I don't like the idea of being tied to that for real-time communications. And I tell, again, the expectation is set there, sort of in Francis's perspective, right? I've told everybody, you send me wedding invitations and those kinds of things. Yeah, you could email those to me because those are not super time sensitive. But if you really need me, pick up the phone, send a text message. There are better, more real-time communication platforms for that kind of message. And then I also wanted to clarify just very, very quickly that I have a stance on concentrating communications into as few inboxes as possible. And I don't want to conflate that with the fact that I said I wanted as few inboxes as possible, email accounts, that is, as possible. I have as few email inboxes, but I am attempting to consolidate those communications into those particular veins, right, into those categories. So for example, my personal email inbox receives all of my personal communications, right? So I have Google Voice sending my personal text messages and my personal voicemail to my inbox, my email inbox, and that's where I can process it better. And the professional stuff flows in there, right? But thankfully, because of the technology, I can just text message on my phone and answer and listen to voicemail on my phone if I want to, but if I don't, I can always catch it up. It's like bringing up the rear guard when I go back to my email account, right? When I go back to my email software. So just remember that this is flexible. It's adaptive based on your particular needs.
I have written a lot about the fact that I encourage people not to check email on their phones, and get email out of their phone. And I have get asked this question, well, that's fine, but what do you do when you're traveling? Well, the beauty of this is you can be as flexible as you need and unflexible as you don't need to. Their email address, if I'm traveling, last week the last 2 weeks actually I went traveling, and I activate some of my email address on the phone. Why? Well, because that was basically the computer that was going to be with me for most of the day. I wasn't carrying the iPad, and therefore that was the computer until I get to the hotel, and I could not go 6 hours without checking emails. Okay, work expect me to be a little bit more responsive than that. Okay, so be okay with those exceptions to the rule. If what you just need to make sure is that you are checking them when it's appropriate, and you are not checking just to check to see if there is anything that can get your attention.
Again, the fear of missing out, FOMO.
Right. I just wanted to add a point around what app developers are not doing. So when I noticed that the app developers for email clients, whether separate apps, standalone app, desktop, web, whatever, and even on smartphones, they're not taking into account the user sort of described that we bounce around different kinds of email apps, and we swap between them in all these different sort of idiosyncratic ways. What I find is that even app developers that put in a syncing ability between apps, what they are not doing is looking at from our level as the users and saying, I use 5 different apps and I use 20 different inboxes for the following reasons. And then designing from the behavior, starting with the behavior that I think we're all saying we use multiples of everything. No one is designing from our point of view. So we're sort of left having to assemble our own sort of solutions, our own individual solutions without any guidance. So even for example, a blog post that says, here, if you want the following result, which is managing lots of different emails for lots of different reasons, here's a playbook for how you would construct the 4 or 5 apps you should use, and how you should distribute and how you should which ones you should sync with each other. Because essentially what we're doing is we're assembling these little ecosystems without any guidance. So I think someone were to step up and say, okay, I'm going to help you to assemble your email ecosystem that would serve your needs. Boy, that would go a long way.
And we're going to have an entire episode, as I said earlier in the show, on Inbox Zero, a concept called Inbox One that I kind of alluded to a little bit earlier, and processing email messages. And we'll talk quite a bit more about this in that future episode, and I'm sure in future episodes as well. In the remaining time, gentlemen, I'd like to talk about what email applications we currently use and why. So we have just 5 minutes. So just briefly, who wants to get started with regard to what email applications you use and why to manage your multiple email accounts?
I can start, so that way we go from the most boring to the most entertaining. I work on the vanilla standard mail.app on the iPad, and that's where every account is and where everything is.
I use Outlook as my primary, but I have, so it takes 3, 4, 5 of my different email accounts, the ones that I said are public facing, they all come into this one. And I also have access to Gmail, of course. And I have a different app that I use on my my smartphone, primarily because it allows me to delete email from the smartphone but not delete it from the server. That's the only reason I use this particular app. I think that's about it. The others are web apps of kind of a similar nature.
I run Outlook on my desktop, my Windows desktop. I run it on my Android phone. I use the Gmail web client for a lot of things that don't parallel themselves into Outlook. I've used, Lord knows how many different apps on the phone trying to find one that works cleanly. For me, the big thing is rapid processing. So I need an app that allows me to control the swipe functionality. Outlook allows me to control it in a way where I can set a left swipe doing one thing and a right swipe doing another, and it be consistent. And then I can actually flip through my emails very quickly and process them. There was a great app for a while called Alto. Unfortunately, they have discontinued it, which seems to be the lot in life that most of these have. That was very powerful at allowing that kind of control. But Outlook is the primary one I use, and it's mostly for the fact that it's fairly consistent. For me, it's got to be, everything has to be able to synchronize back to the cloud. So the clients themselves are just interacting with the web servers themselves, and the behavior has to be consistent. So will I stick with Outlook forever? Probably not. I'll probably find something else. Who knows?
So for me, I use several applications across my ecosystem in order to manage email. So I use currently Newton, which is a subscription-based email software for iOS, Android, Mac, and Windows. And that has actually been really great. Now, in deference to Francis's situation where you might be using POP3, it doesn't handle non-IMAPT email accounts. And so, there's just a problem with handling legacy application infrastructure or email infrastructure, that is. And POP is definitely one of them. And so, a lot of these developers have basically decided not to support legacy technologies. And I think there's a certain, I understand why, because it takes resources to be able to do so. But I also recognize that email is a very old technology, and there needs to be some level of backwards compatibility for these systems. And as much as I don't use it anymore, I still understand that there are a lot of people who still do. So that's my desktop environment. I'm sorry. So Newton is one that I use, and then Opera Mail is the other, and that segments the email addresses that I don't want, email accounts that I don't want to be checking on my phone or in any sense of the matter real time. I'm sorry, I said that backwards. So Newton handles all of my kind of real time email that I want to be able to access across both phone and desktop, on mobile and desktop. I use Opera Mail, which is Opera, the web browser, has their own email client. And the Opera Mail client, which is also free software that is a flavor of open source. And I use that for the desktop, and I use that to access pretty much everything else. On my mobile phone, I use the Gmail app. I use Inbox by Gmail, which I use for fairly light processing. And we'll talk about that obviously in the next episode. Newton, and then Outlook. So I separate those email accounts across different devices. And this really helps with just managing notifications.
If you can figure out a way to clean out my freaking inbox, I'd be happy. I mean, that's much. I think that's the challenge that everybody has when you look at email. I mean, I've wanted to use email as an instant messenger in times. It's a task list. It's a calendar reference. It's the biggest catch-all bucket that we've got. And I can't think of anything that's more frustrating. So if we can focus on some ways of identifying how we clean this mess up, I know I would be happy.
Well, I think you have provided a perfect segue, which is to say that our next episode is going to be about inbox processing and inbox 1 and getting to inbox 0 if that's a reality for you or a desire for you. And that's what we're going to talk about in the next episode. So I'm really excited to do that. And so thank you to Augusto, Art, and Francis for joining me here on this show today. I want to make sure our listeners know that if you have a question or a comment about this episode, please head over to productivitycast.net/contact and let us know if you have something that we discussed that you have a question about, or if you have a comment about the show. Touch base with us. Let us know. We're always excited and happy to hear from our listeners. You can find this episode's show notes and how to subscribe at productivitycast.net/028 for episode 28. Here's to your productive life.
That's it for this Productivity Cast, the weekly show about all things productivity, with your hosts, Ray Sidney Smith and Augusto Pinaud, with Francis Wade and Art Gelwicks.